1. The Dashwood Family. For very many years, there had been Dashwoods living in Sussex, in the south of England. The family owned a large area of land around their country house, Norland Park. Recently, the head of the family, an unmarried man of great age, had invited into his home his nephew, who was expected to inherit the house and land, with his wife and children. The nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, and his wife behaved kindly and thoughtfully towards the old gentleman, not from interest in his fortune, but from goodness of heart, so that he was able to spend his last years comfortably with these pleasant and cheerful companions. By his first wife, Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son, John. By his present wife, 3 daughters. John, a respectable, serious young man, had received a large inheritance from his mother, and had also added to his wealth by his own marriage. To him, therefore, the Norland fortune was not as important as to his sisters, who had very little money of their own. When the old gentleman died, it was discovered that he had not left his fortune to Henry Dashwood to do what he liked with, but only to use during his lifetime. On Henry Dashwood's death, the inheritance would pass to his son John, and to John's son, a child of 4 years old. The old man had become fond of the small boy on his occasional visits to Norland, and so a spoilt child was preferred to Henry Dashwood's gentle wife and daughters, in spite of their years of loving care. No unkindness had been intended, however, and as a sign of his affection for the girls, the old gentleman left them £1,000 each. At first, Mr. Henry Dashwood was bitterly disappointed, as he had wanted the fortune more for his wife and daughters than for himself. But he soon realized that if he was careful with money in the next few years, he could save enough to provide generously for his family. Unfortunately, he did not live to carry out this plan, as he survived his uncle by only 1 year, and £10,000 was all that remained for his widow and daughters. Just before his death, he sent for his son, and begged him to take care of his stepmother and sisters. Mr. John Dashwood had not the strong feelings of the rest of the family, but such a request at such a time naturally had an effect on him, so he promised to do everything he could to make his father's family comfortable. He was not a bad young man, but rather cold-hearted and rather selfish, although he was, in general, well respected. If he had married a pleasanter woman, he would probably have been even more respected, and perhaps have become pleasanter himself, but his wife was colder and more selfish than he was. As soon as his father was dead and buried, Mrs. John Dashwood arrived unexpectedly at Norland with her child and her servants. She wished to make it clear that, as the house belonged to her husband from the moment of his father's death, she did not need any invitation from her mother-in-law. To a widow in Mrs. Dashwood's situation, this appeared unforgivable. In fact, Mrs. Dashwood, a sensitive and generous woman, felt so strongly about her daughter-in-law's unpleasant behaviour that she would have left the house immediately if her eldest daughter had not begged her to reconsider. Eleanor, this eldest daughter, whose advice was so useful, had a great deal of intelligence and common sense, and although only 19, frequently acted as her mother's adviser. To the advantage of the whole family, she was often able to persuade Mrs. Dashwood to hold back the violent enthusiasms which were likely to lead them all into difficulties. Eleanor had an excellent heart, full of affection, and although her feelings were strong, she knew how to control them. This was something which her mother had not yet learnt to do, and which Marianne, one of her sisters, had decided never to learn. Marianne was, like Eleanor, generous, clever, and sensitive, but unlike Eleanor, she was eager in everything. Her feelings were always strongly felt and expressed. In this, she was very similar to her mother. Eleanor saw with concern how little her sister could control her feelings, but her mother loved Marianne for her sensibility. Now, after Mr. Henry Dashwood's death, Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne encouraged each other in the violence of their unhappiness, becoming more and more miserable as they remembered the past and thought bitterly of the future. Eleanor, too, suffered deeply, but she could still make an effort to discuss business with her brother, be polite to her sister-in-law, and try to persuade her mother to be calmer. The youngest sister, Margaret, was a pleasant girl of 13, but as she already had some of Marianne's sensibility, and not much of her intelligence, she seemed likely to grow up without her sister's advantages. Mrs. John Dashwood now made sure that everyone knew she was mistress of Norland, and that her mother-in-law and sisters-in-law were there as visitors. Her husband, however, reminded her of the promise he had given to his dying father, that he would take care of his stepmother and sisters. "I had thought, my dear," he added, "of giving the girls £1,000 each. It would certainly be a generous present for them." Mrs. John Dashwood did not at all approve of this. It would mean taking £3,000 from the fortune of their dear little boy. She begged her husband to think again. How could he rob his child, and his only child too, of so much money? And how could the Miss Dashwoods, who were related to him only by half-blood, which she considered no relation at all, possibly expect him to be so generous? "It was my father's last request to me," replied her husband. "I must keep my promise to him. I must do something for them when they leave Norland for a new home." "Well, then, do something for them. But you need not give them £3,000. Consider that when you have given the money, it will never come back. Your sisters will marry, and it will be gone from the family for ever." "You are right, my dear," said her husband seriously. "Perhaps I should give them half that. £500 would be a valuable present for them." "Oh, beyond anything. What brother on earth would do half as much for his sisters, even if really his sisters, and as it is, only half-blood? But you have such a generous nature." "I would not wish to do anything mean. It is better on such occasions to do too much rather than too little. Even they themselves cannot expect more." "There is no knowing what they may expect," said the lady. "But the question is, what you can afford to do." "Certainly. And I think I can afford to give them £500 each. As it is, without my money, they will each have more than £3,000 on their mother's death, a very comfortable fortune for any young woman." "Indeed it is. And in fact, I begin to think they need no extra money at all. They will be able to live very comfortably together on the interest of their £10,000. That is very true. And therefore I wonder whether, on the whole, it would be more advisable to pay some money regularly to my stepmother during her lifetime, instead of giving money to the girls. 100 a year would make her and the girls, while they live with her, perfectly comfortable. His wife hesitated a little over this plan. That is certainly better than giving £1,500 all at once, but if Mrs. Dashwood should live for longer than 15 years, it would cost us more. She is very fit and healthy, and only just 40, and it is an unpleasant thing to have to pay the money out every year. One feels one's fortune is not one's own. I believe you are right, my love. Whatever I can give them occasionally will be of far greater assistance than a yearly allowance, because they would only live more expensively if they felt sure of receiving a larger income. If I give them a present of £50 now and then, I will, I think, be keeping my promise to my father in the fullest manner. To be sure you will. Indeed, to tell the truth, I am certain your father had no idea of your giving them any money at all. The assistance he was thinking of was, I dare say, looking for a comfortable, small house for them, helping them to move their furniture, and sending them occasional presents of fish and meat in season. Do consider, Mr. Dashwood, how very cheaply they will live. No carriage, no horses, and only 1 or 2 servants. I cannot imagine how they will spend half their money, and it is foolish to think of giving them more. They will much more be able to give you something. I believe you are perfectly right, said Mr. Dashwood. Now I understand clearly what my father meant, and he decided to offer no more to his father's widow and daughters than such neighbourly assistance as his wife suggested. Meanwhile, his stepmother, impatient to leave Norland, which held so many memories for her, had been looking for a suitable house to move into not too far away. Several houses, which she would have approved, had already been turned down by Eleanor as too large for their income, and the search continued. 6 months passed, with the 2 families living at Norland. Mrs. Dashwood came to dislike her daughter-in-law more and more, and would have found it impossible to live in the same house with her for so long, if something had not happened to make Mrs. Dashwood want to keep her daughters at Norland for a while. She had noticed a growing attachment between her eldest girl and Mrs. John Dashwood's brother, a gentlemanly and pleasing young man, who had come to Norland soon after his sister's arrival, and who had spent the greater part of his time there since then. Edward Ferrars was the elder son of a man who had died very rich, but his future wealth was uncertain, because the whole of his fortune depended on his mother's wishes. Neither of these facts influenced Mrs. Dashwood. It was enough for her that he loved her daughter, and that Eleanor returned his affection. Edward Ferrars was not handsome, nor were his manners especially pleasing at first sight, but when he lost his shyness, his behaviour showed what an open, affectionate heart he had. His mother and sister wanted him to make a fine figure in the world in some way, but Edward was not ambitious. All his wishes were for home comforts and the quietness of private life. Fortunately, he had a younger brother, Robert, who was more promising. Mrs. Dashwood completely approved of Edward, in spite of his quiet manner, which was so unlike the way she felt a young man should behave. As soon as she saw the smallest sign of love in his behaviour to Eleanor, she considered their serious attachment as certain, and looked forward to their marriage in the near future. "In a few months, my dear Marianne," she said, "Eleanor will be married, We shall miss her, but she will be happy. Oh, Mamma, how shall we manage without her? My love, we shall live within a few miles of her and see her every day. You will have a brother, a real, affectionate brother. But you look serious, Marianne. Do you disapprove of your sister's choice? Perhaps I am a little surprised, Mamma. He is very pleasant, but there is something missing. There is no fire in his eyes, and I am afraid, Mamma, he has no real taste. He does not seem very interested in music, and I think he knows little of drawing or painting. And he is so calm when we discuss or read beautiful writing. It breaks my heart to hear him talk so quietly and with so little sensibility about things that matter so much to me. I could not be happy with a man who does not share all my feelings. Eleanor may be happy with him, as she has not my feelings, but, Mamma, the more I know of the world, the more I am certain I shall never see a man I can really love. Remember, my love, you are not 17 yet. It is too early in life to lose hope of happiness. Why should you be less fortunate than your mother? Eleanor herself felt that Edward stood very high in her opinion. She believed that he also felt warmly towards her, but she was not sure enough of this to be comfortable with her sister's and mother's dreams of marriage for her. Edward sometimes appeared strangely depressed when he was with her, which worried her a little. She knew that his mother was making life difficult for him, and would perhaps disapprove of his marrying a woman with no great fortune. But sometimes she feared that he thought of her as no more than a friend. Marianne and her mother had no such doubts, believing strongly that any intelligent young man must love Eleanor, and that love itself would solve all problems. Marianne, indeed, was quite horrified when her sister cautiously described her feelings for Edward as liking and respect, rather than love. Like him? Respect him? She cried. Oh, cold-hearted Eleanor! Why should you be ashamed of expressing love? Mrs. John Dashwood had also noticed the attachment between her brother and Eleanor. It made her uneasy, and she took the first opportunity of upsetting her mother-in-law by explaining her family's high ambitions for Edward and the importance of his marrying well, and the danger for any young woman attempting to trap him into marriage. Mrs. Dashwood could not prevent herself from giving a sharp answer, and left the room at once, determined, in spite of the inconvenience, to remove herself and her daughters from Norland as soon as possible. On the same day, she received a letter from Sir John Middleton, a gentleman who was a distant relation of hers. He wrote to offer her a small house near his home in Devonshire, where she and her girls could make their new home. Although it was only a cottage, he promised to do anything necessary to make it more comfortable. His letter was written in such a friendly way, and she was so anxious to leave Norland and her unfeeling daughter-in-law, that after first asking Eleanor's opinion, Mrs. Dashwood wrote to accept Sir John Middleton's kind offer. Chapter 2. A New Home. Mrs. Dashwood took great pleasure in informing her stepson and his wife that she had found a house, and that she and her daughters would soon trouble them no longer. Mrs. John Dashwood said nothing, but her husband showed some surprise. "I do hope," he said politely, "that you will not be far from Norland." Mrs. Dashwood replied with a smile that they were going to Devonshire. Edward Ferrars, who was in the room at the time, turned quickly towards her when he heard this. "Devonshire?" he repeated. "Are you really going there? So far from here? And to what part, may I ask?" "A place called Barton, 4 miles north of the city of Exeter," replied Mrs. Dashwood. "It is only a cottage, but I hope that many of my friends will come to visit me there." She gave a very kind invitation to Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood to visit her at Barton, and to Edward she gave one with even greater affection. Although her recent conversation with her daughter-in-law had made her determined to leave Norland as soon as possible, she did not in the least intend that Edward and Eleanor should be separated. By giving such a clear invitation to Edward, she wished to show that her daughter-in-law's disapproval of the attachment between Edward and Eleanor had not had the smallest effect. Mr. John Dashwood told his stepmother again and again how extremely sorry he was that she had taken a house so distant from Norland that he could not give her assistance in moving her furniture. He really did feel sorry, because he had decided to limit his promise to his father to this one offer of help, which would not now be of any use. The furniture was sent to Devonshire by ship. It mainly consisted of sheets, dinner plates, books, and a handsome piano of Marianne's. Mrs. John Dashwood was sorry to see the boxes leave. She felt it unnecessary for Mrs. Dashwood, who had such a small income, to have any good furniture at all. Mrs. Dashwood took the house, Barton Cottage, for 12 months. It was furnished and ready for them to move into at once. All the necessary arrangements were quickly made. Eleanor advised her mother to sell her carriage, which, with the horses, would cost too much to keep, and to limit the number of their servants to 3. 2 of the servants were sent to Devonshire immediately, to prepare the house for their mistress's arrival. On his deathbed, Henry Dashwood had told his wife of the promise his son had made, and Mrs. Dashwood had never doubted that John would keep that promise. Now, as she and her daughters were about to leave Norland, was a most suitable time for him to offer them help. But Mrs. Dashwood soon began to lose hope. He so frequently talked of the rising costs of managing his house and land that he seemed in need of more money himself, rather than having any intention of giving money away. Soon they were ready to depart, and many were the tears that fell during their goodbyes to the home they loved so much. "Dear, dear Norland," said Marianne, walking alone in the park on their last evening. "I shall miss you all my life." During the first part of their journey to Devonshire, they were too miserable to notice anything. But when they entered Barton Valley, they became more cheerful and began to show interest in the countryside that would soon be part of their everyday life. It was a pleasant green valley, with thick woods and open fields. After driving for more than a mile, they reached their house. Barton Cottage was well built and in good condition. There were 2 sitting rooms downstairs, and 4 bedrooms and 2 servants' rooms upstairs. Compared with Norland, it was certainly poor and small, and the girls' tears flowed as they remembered their family home. But they soon dried their eyes and made every effort to be happy. Mrs. Dashwood was, on the whole, very pleased with the house, but she looked forward to making some changes. "We can make ourselves quite comfortable here for the moment," she said, "as it is too late in the year to start any building work. To be sure, the house is rather too small for us, but perhaps next year, if I have plenty of money, as I expect I shall, we may think about enlarging the sitting rooms and adding a new dining room and another bedroom. That may be easily done. It is a pity the stairs are not more handsome, but I suppose it would not be difficult to widen them. I shall see how much I have saved in the spring." It was not quite clear how all this work could be done from the savings of an income of 500 a year by a woman who had never saved in her life. So meanwhile they were wise enough to accept the house as it was. They spent their first day arranging their things around them to make themselves a home. Soon after breakfast the next day, they received a visit from their landlord, the gentleman who owned Barton Cottage. Sir John Middleton was a good-looking, cheerful man of about 40, who seemed really delighted by their arrival. He welcomed them to Barton, offering them anything from his own house and garden, Barton Park, that was lacking at the cottage. He showed a warm interest in their comfort, and hoped that they would meet his own family socially as often as possible. His kindness was not limited to words, because soon after he had left them, a large basket full of fruit and vegetables arrived from the park, followed by another of meat and fish. His wife, Lady Middleton, came to visit them the next day. The Dashwoods were, of course, very anxious to see a person on whom so much of their comfort at Barton must depend. Although at first they admired the elegance of her appearance and her manners, they soon realized that she did not have her husband's warmth or anything of interest to say. However, there was no lack of conversation, as Lady Middleton had wisely brought her eldest child with her, a fine little boy of about 6. As a result, there was always something to talk about. The ladies had to ask his name and age, admire his beauty, and ask him questions which his mother answered for him. A child should be taken on every social call in order to assist conversation. In the present situation, it took at least 10 minutes to determine whether the boy was most like his father or mother, and why. Everybody thought differently, and everybody was astonished at the opinions of the others. The Dashwoods would soon be given the chance to discuss the rest of the children, as Sir John had made them promise to have dinner at the park the next day. Barton Park was about half a mile from the cottage. It was a large, handsome house, where the Middletons lived in great comfort. Neither of them had taste or any interest in books or music. Sir John was a sportsman, Lady Middleton a mother. He could only go shooting for half the year, while his wife was able to spoil her children all year round. He was so hospitable that they almost always had relations or friends staying in the house. But Lady Middleton's main interest lay in the elegance of her table and her domestic arrangements, of which she was extremely proud. Sir John's enjoyment of society was much more real than his wife's. He took delight in collecting about him more young people than his house would hold, and the noisier they were, the better he liked it. Barton Park was famous for its summer parties and excursions, and its winter dances. Sir John was delighted with Mrs. Dashwood and her young, pretty daughters. When they arrived at the park that evening, he was at the door to welcome them, and repeated several times his concern that he had been unable to get any fashionable young men to meet them. There was, he said, only one gentleman there, a particular friend who was staying at the house, but who was neither very young nor very sociable. He apologized for the smallness of the party and promised that it would never happen again. Luckily, Lady Middleton's mother had just arrived, and as she was a cheerful, pleasant woman, he hoped the young ladies would not find the evening too dull. Mrs. Jennings, his mother-in-law, was a cheerful, fat, rather vulgar old lady, who laughed and talked a great deal. During dinner, she said many amusing things about lovers and husbands, and hoped the Miss Dashwoods had not left their hearts behind them in Sussex. Colonel Brandon, Sir John's particular friend, seemed as different from his friend as Mrs. Jennings was from her daughter. He was silent and serious. His appearance, however, was not unpleasing, in spite of his being, in Marianne's and Margaret's opinion, an absolute old bachelor, because he was on the wrong side of 35. After dinner, Marianne was invited to sing and play the piano. Sir John was loud in his admiration at the end of every song, and as loud in his conversation with others while every song lasted. Lady Middleton frowned at him for talking, but then requested a song which Marianne had just finished. Only Colonel Brandon listened attentively, without any false show of delight. Marianne felt a respect for him that the others, with their lack of taste, did not deserve. He clearly took pleasure in music, although perhaps not with her own depth of feeling. However, she was reasonable enough to accept that a man as old as 35, like the Colonel, may well have outlived real feeling and true enjoyment. Mrs. Jennings was a widow with a comfortable fortune. She had lived to see both her daughters respectably married, and now had nothing to do but to marry off the rest of the world. She spent most of her time planning weddings for all the young people she knew, and was remarkably quick at discovering attachments. Soon after her arrival at Barton, this quickness enabled her to inform the Middletons and the Dashwoods that Colonel Brandon was very much in love with Marianne. She was perfectly sure of it. It would be an excellent marriage, as he was rich and she was handsome. For a long time Mrs. Jennings had been eager to get Colonel Brandon well married, and she was always anxious to get a good husband for every pretty girl. The immediate advantage to herself was that she could make endless jokes against them both. At the cottage she laughed at Marianne, and at the park she laughed at the Colonel. Marianne herself did not know whether to be amused or annoyed. "It is such a silly accusation, Mamma, and I think it very unfeeling of Mrs. Jennings to laugh so cruelly at old Colonel Brandon. He is old enough to be my father." "My dear," said Mrs. Dashwood, smiling, "I cannot think a man 5 years younger than myself so extremely ancient as he appears to you." "But, Mamma, really, he must have long outlived any feelings of love by now, if he ever had any when he was younger. When is a man to be safe from such cruel jokes if age and bodily weakness cannot protect him?" "Bodily weakness?" said Eleanor. "I know that he is older than we are, but surely you must accept that he still has the full use of his arms and legs. Did you not hear him complain of having a bad back?" "My dearest child," said her mother, laughing, "it must seem to you quite astonishing that my life has lasted to the great age of 40. Mamma, be serious. I know very well that Colonel Brandon is not old enough for his friends to worry yet about losing him. He may live for another 20 years. But 35 should have nothing to do with marriage. Perhaps, said Eleanor, 35 and 17 had better not have anything to do with marriage together. But a single woman of 27, for example, could easily consider Colonel Brandon's 35 years no disadvantage. A woman of 27, said Marianne, after a moment's thought, can never hope to feel true love again. And if her home is uncomfortable or her fortune small, I suppose that she could accept the duties of a nurse in order to become a wife. It would be a marriage of convenience if Colonel Brandon married such a woman. The world would be happy with it, but in my eyes it would be no marriage at all. It seems a little hard, said Eleanor reasonably, that you consider Colonel Brandon so ill that he is in need of nursing, only because he happened to complain yesterday of a pain in his shoulder. After all, it was a cold, wet day. But Marianne's views remained the same. Soon after this, however, when Eleanor had left the room, Marianne spoke to her mother with some urgency in her voice. "Mamma, I am anxious about Edward Ferrars. I am sure he is ill. We have now been here almost 2 weeks, and he still has not come to see Eleanor." "My dear, be patient," answered Mrs. Dashwood. "I did not expect him so soon, and I feel sure Eleanor does not expect him either. When we were talking yesterday of a new fireplace for the spare bedroom, she said there was no hurry, as the room would not be needed for some time." "How strange! What can be the meaning of it? How cold, how calm their last goodbyes were. And Eleanor is so self-controlled. She is never sad or restless or miserable. I cannot understand her." Chapter 3. A Handsome Stranger. The Miss Dashwoods now began to feel really at home at Barton. They went walking and practised their drawing and music with far greater enjoyment than at any time since the death of their father. They did not have many visitors, except for those from Barton Park, as there were few other houses within walking distance. There was, in fact, a large, comfortable-looking house about a mile from the cottage, in the village of Allenham, but they heard that its owner, an old lady of good character called Mrs. Smith, was unfortunately not well enough to mix in society. There were beautiful walks all around them, in the green wooded valleys, and on the hills behind the cottage. One morning, Marianne and Margaret, taking no notice of their mother's and Eleanor's warnings of rain, decided to walk on one of these hills. They climbed to the top, delighted to see blue sky between the clouds, and laughing at the wind that caught at their hair and clothes. "Nothing in the world could be better than this," called Marianne. "What a pity Mamma and Eleanor did not come with us." But in a few minutes the blue sky disappeared, the dark clouds gathered, and driving rain began to beat down on their faces. Surprised and disappointed, they were forced to turn back. Fortunately, they were not far from home. It was just a matter of running with all possible speed down the steep side of the hill which led to their garden gate. At first, Marianne was ahead, but a false step brought her suddenly to the ground, and Margaret, unable to stop herself, carried on down the hill and through the garden gate. A gentleman, who was out shooting, was walking up the hill when Marianne's accident happened. He put down his gun and ran to help her. She had hurt her ankle and could not stand. the gentleman offered his assistance, and in spite of Marianne's protests, took her up in his arms and carried her down the hill. He took her straight into the house and placed her carefully on a sofa in the sitting-room. Eleanor and her mother rose in astonishment as the stranger entered, carrying Marianne. While they both looked at him, secretly admiring his unusually handsome appearance, he apologized most politely for his rude entrance. Even if he had been old, ugly, and vulgar, Mrs. Dashwood would have been extremely grateful to him for taking care of her child. But the influence of his looks and elegance touched her deepest feelings. She thanked him again and again, and asked the name of the person to whom she owed so much. He replied that his name was Willoughby. His present home was at Allenham, and he sincerely hoped that she would allow him to call tomorrow to inquire after Miss Dashwood. Permission was immediately given, and he then departed, to make himself still more interesting in the middle of a heavy shower of rain. There was general admiration of his manly beauty. Marianne had seen less of his person than the others, because of her natural confusion when he lifted her in his arms, but his appearance and behaviour seemed all that was perfect to her. Her imagination was busy, her thoughts were pleasant, and the pain of a turned ankle went unnoticed. When Sir John next visited them, he heard all about Marianne's accident, and was eagerly asked whether he knew of any gentleman of the name of Willoughby at Allenham. "Willoughby!" cried Sir John. "Of course I do. He comes here every year. I shall invite him to dinner on Thursday." "What sort of young man is he?" "A good man to know, I can tell you. He shoots well, and there isn't a better rider in England." "And is that all you can say for him?" cried Marianne. "But what does he think? What are the interests close to his heart?" Sir John looked puzzled. "Well, I don't know as much as that about him, but he's pleasant and sociable, and has got the nicest little gun dog I ever saw. Did you see his dog?" "But who is he?" asked Eleanor. "Where does he come from? Where does he live? Has he a house at Allenham?" This time Sir John had more exact answers to give. He told them Mr. Willoughby had no house of his own in Devonshire, but stayed there only while visiting the old lady, Mrs. Smith, at Allenham. It appeared that he was related to her and would inherit her fortune. "Yes," Sir John added to Eleanor, "he is well worth catching. He has a house and land in Somerset as well, and if I were you, I wouldn't allow my younger sister to have him, in spite of all this falling down hills. Miss Marianne must not expect to have all the men to herself. Brandon will be jealous if she does not take care." "I do not believe," said Mrs. Dashwood, smiling, "that either of my daughters will make any attempts at what you call catching him. It is not an employment to which they have been brought up. Men are very safe with us, however rich they are. I am glad to hear, however, that he is a respectable young man, whom we can meet socially." "I remember last Christmas," said Sir John, "at a little dance at the park. He danced from 8 till 4 without once sitting down, and he was up again at 8 to go shooting." "Was he?" cried Marianne with shining eyes. "That is what I like. A young man who is enthusiastic and eager in all he does, who never gets tired." "I see how it will be," said Sir John. "You will be interested in him now, and never think of poor Brandon." Marianne's rescuer, as Margaret called him, arrived at the cottage early next morning, and was received by Mrs. Dashwood with more than politeness. During his visit, Willoughby rapidly became aware of the sense, elegance, affection, and domestic comfort of the family to whom an accident had introduced him. Both Eleanor and Marianne had pretty faces and lovely figures, but in Marianne's beautiful dark eyes burned an eager fire which drew Willoughby to her. She could not be silent when he spoke of music and dancing, and showed no shyness in their discussion. They soon discovered how many interests and opinions they shared, and long before his visit came to an end, they were talking and laughing together like old friends. Willoughby visited Barton Cottage every day after that. At first his intention was supposedly to inquire politely after Marianne's health, but soon he pretended no longer and came to spend the whole day at her side in complete enjoyment of her company. They read, they talked, they sang together, and Marianne found in Willoughby all the taste and sensibility which Edward Ferrars unfortunately lacked. Mrs. Dashwood considered him as faultless as Marianne did. Even Eleanor saw nothing wrong in him, except for the habit, which Marianne shared, of being too ready to express an opinion about other people, and of putting his personal pleasure above social correctness. Marianne now began to realize she had been wrong to believe there was no such creature as the perfect man. Willoughby met her idea of perfection exactly, and his behaviour showed that he shared her wishes for their future. Her mother, too, had thoughts of their marriage, and secretly congratulated herself on having two such sons-in-law as Edward and Willoughby. Eleanor, however, was concerned to see that Mrs. Jennings had been right, and Colonel Brandon appeared to be deeply in love with Marianne. What hope could there be for a silent man of 35 against a sociable one of 25? Perhaps she pitied him even more, because Willoughby and Marianne seemed determined to laugh at him for being old and dull. "Brandon is just the kind of man," said Willoughby one day, "whom everybody speaks well of, and nobody cares for." "He is respected by all the family at the park, however," said Eleanor sharply, "and his conversation is always pleasant." "But he has nothing of interest to say," cried Marianne. "He has common sense. That is what I like about him. He is perfectly respectable, well-informed, and, I believe, sincere." "Well, Miss Dashwood," said Willoughby, laughing, "I have 3 unanswerable reasons for disliking Colonel Brandon. He told me it would rain when I wanted it to be fine. He does not approve of my new carriage, and I cannot persuade him to buy my horse. So, in spite of your very sensible opinion, I shall go on disliking him forever." When they moved to Barton, the Dashwoods never imagined that their days would be so completely filled with parties, visits, and excursions. Sir John could not rest if there were young people to amuse, and every day there was a boat trip, or a supper party, or a drive in the countryside, or a dance at the park. In every meeting of the kind Willoughby was included, which gave him the opportunity to develop his connection with the Dashwood family, to show his deep admiration for Marianne, and to receive, in her behaviour to himself, the clearest possible proof of her affection. Eleanor could not be surprised at their attachment. She only wished it could be less openly shown, and once or twice tried to suggest to Marianne that she should have more self-control. But Marianne, and Willoughby too, believed that real feelings should never be hidden, and that it would be false to do so. When Willoughby was present, Marianne had eyes for no one else. Eleanor's happiness was not as great as her sister's. In Devonshire she had found no companion who could make her forget the delights of her former home and Sussex friends. Only Colonel Brandon came closest to being the kind of friend she needed. He often fell into conversation with her, as he seemed to find some relief in talking to her about Marianne. "Your sister, I understand, does not approve of second attachments," he said one evening, his eyes fixed on Marianne, who was dancing with Willoughby. "No," replied Eleanor. "Her opinions are all romantic. She believes that we fall in love once only in our lives, but I hope that in a few years she will become more sensible. That may happen, but when a romantic young mind is forced to change, what serious results there can be. I speak from experience. I knew a young lady once who—" Here he stopped suddenly, and appeared to think he had said too much. Eleanor felt almost sure that his was a story of disappointed love, and her pity for him grew. The next morning, Eleanor heard a piece of news that astonished her. Marianne told her with the greatest delight that Willoughby had promised to give her a horse, so that he and she could go riding together. She had not given a moment's thought to the cost of keeping the animal, or to what society might think of her receiving such an expensive present from a young man who was not a relation. It took Eleanor some time to make her understand that she could not possibly accept the gift, but finally Marianne agreed, although unwillingly. The next day Eleanor gained a still clearer picture of Marianne's attachment to Willoughby. Margaret came excitedly to tell her that she was sure Marianne would marry Willoughby very soon. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, "I have such a secret to tell you. I saw them last night after tea. Mr. Willoughby was begging Marianne for something, and then he cut off a long lock of her hair, kissed it, and put it in his pocket." Eleanor now felt sure they were engaged, and was only surprised that they had not told their relations and friends. Sir John's latest plan for their amusement was to visit a very fine house and garden called Whitwell the following day. A large group of them would go in carriages, taking food and drink with them in baskets, and a most enjoyable day was expected. As Whitwell belonged to Colonel Brandon's brother-in-law, the Colonel would go with them. It appeared that he alone could arrange for them to visit the house. Unfortunately, however, while they were at breakfast at the park, where the whole party had gathered, a letter was delivered to the Colonel. He looked quickly at it, and hurried out of the room without a word. In a few moments he returned, looking more serious than usual, and explained that urgent business called him to London, and he would not, therefore, be able to join the party visiting Whitwell. He would not explain further, in spite of Mrs. Jennings' insistent questioning. Everybody except Eleanor tried hard to persuade him to put off his business so that the excursion could take place, but he could not be influenced, and left the house after wishing them a good day. As the excursion was no longer possible, it was decided that the party would drive around the countryside instead, and the carriages were ordered. Willoughby's was first, and Marianne never looked happier than when she got into it. He drove away very fast, and they were soon out of sight. Nothing more was seen of them until their return in the afternoon. That evening, as they all sat down to dinner, Mrs. Jennings spoke quietly to Marianne, but loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "I have found you out, miss, in spite of your cleverness," I know where you spent the morning." Marianne blushed and said quickly, "Where?" Mrs. Jennings smiled knowingly. "I hope you like your house, Miss Marianne. It is certainly very large, and when I come to see you in it, I hope you will have refurnished it. It badly needed new furniture when I was last there." Marianne turned away in confusion. Mrs. Jennings laughed loudly and explained that she had discovered from the servants that Marianne and Willoughby had gone to Allenham and spent a considerable time going all over Mrs. Smith's house. Eleanor found this difficult to believe. Marianne had never been introduced to Mrs. Smith, and it would have been very bad manners for her to enter the house while Mrs. Smith was in it. However, when she asked her sister, she found that the story was true, and Marianne was quite angry with her for doubting it. "Why should I not visit the house?" cried Marianne. "I never spent a pleasanter morning in my life." "I am afraid," replied Eleanor quietly but firmly, "that whatever is pleasant is not always correct." After some minutes of serious thought, Marianne said, "Perhaps, Eleanor, you may be right. I should not have gone. But the rooms are lovely. There is a beautiful little sitting room which would be delightful with modern furniture." She would have described every room in the house if Eleanor had let her. Eleanor had no time to wonder why Colonel Brandon had been so suddenly called away. All her thoughts now centred on Marianne and Willoughby's extraordinary silence about their engagement. There seemed no reason why they should not openly tell her mother and herself, even if they did not plan to marry very soon. Willoughby was not rich. Indeed, he often complained he was poor, so he might have to wait for his inheritance before marrying. But this secrecy was so opposed to their general ideas of openness and honesty that Eleanor began to doubt whether they were really engaged. Nothing could express more affection for them all than Willoughby's behaviour. He seemed to consider the cottage his home, and when Mrs. Dashwood mentioned the future building work she was planning, he appeared almost horrified and begged her not to change even one stone. "No, Mrs. Dashwood," he cried, "do not spoil this house. It is perfect as it is. Remember what happiness I have known here. Promise me you will change nothing, nothing at all." To please him, Mrs. Dashwood dutifully promised. "I am glad of your promise. Now I would ask you one more thing. Tell me that not only your home will remain the same, but that I shall always find you and your family unchanged, and that you will always consider me with the kindness which has made you all so dear to me." The promise was given, and Willoughby's behaviour that evening was a proof of his happiness in their society.